I'm feeling very naked today, sitting out here in this wonderful sunshine, but without props, without a PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to sort of, fly by the seat of our pants. But I don't know. I mean, as Jonathan says, I've had a connection with the Garden Palace. It grew out of the fact that I had been curator at Government House. And during that period, the governor, the then governor of New South Wales, the Honourable Gordon Samuels, had taken residence in the Colonial Secretary's office. And that was a wonderful discovery. As many of you know, it's the building that's on the corner of Bridge and Macquarie Street. It was built or completed by 1879, designed by James Barnett, and it provided the official offices for the Colonial Secretary, Sir Henry Parkes. And since that time, I've sort of become a Parkes aficionado. I don't mean to be a great fan of politicians, but today I actually have to pay an enormous amount of respect and approval to these late 19th century politicians. We've just lost all the young people, because I was thinking, how would I actually get them interested in the subject? And at the time I thought, the kind of public elan, the interest, the excitement of the garden that the Sydney International Exhibition created in 1879 was probably akin to, the Sydney Olympics in 2000. I have to say I was one of those who was ready to jump on a plane and get out of Sydney, but I had a 10-year-old son and, parenting got the better of me. I stayed, and of course it was the most wonderful event. I was caught up with the excitement of the event, the way that everything ran smoothly, kind of the fact that, all the Sydney-siders and foreign visitors were very civil to each other. And it was actually a great time to be in Sydney. And I think it actually opened up my eyes to the wonders of the city in the same way the Garden Palace did that. And I think, I might hand it back to, I'm getting off the point, but I'll go back to Jonathan.
I guess Sir Henry Parkes is this extraordinary figure who really looms large across this building and across this history. Do you want to sort of describe some of, because I always highlight his three significant moments as stopping convict ships, the Garden Palace, and Federation, kind of that you could sort of key mark his political career. But can you sort of talk about why he was so interested in getting the Garden Palace up and running?
Okay, well, I think it's really interesting that in this instance it wasn't a government initiative. The idea had been proposed by a businessman. It was taken up by the Agricultural Society of New South Wales, which is now, of course, the Royal Agricultural Society. They, of course, have been in the practice of mounting colonial exhibitions since the 1860s. And they were held in Prince Alfred Park in, a rather remarkable exhibition building there. When it came up to the proposal received government support in principle, as long as it wasn't going to actually cost the government any money. They refused to fund it at that point. Late 1879, and we're looking at a very short time frame, it was realised that the Agricultural Society wasn't capable. They didn't have the sufficient financial and managerial resources to actually pull off this enterprise. And at that point, the Governor of New South Wales was Sir Hercules Robinson, who was in fact the president of that, aforesaid society. He appealed to Sir Henry Parkes and really raised the spectre of really the public shame that would befall New South Wales if the exhibition was to be cancelled. And so, of course, Parkes had to rally. And then, of course, it became a sort of a calling, I think. I think there were a number of reasons. Like any major government enterprise, there were a number of political objectives. So in this instance, they wanted to firstly attract overseas or international capital. They wanted to widen the network of markets for trade and export and import. They were keen to attract greater immigration. There were other elements that were critical. One was, of course, public education. They were keen to actually make the public of New South Wales aware of the latest technology, scientific advancements, art and cultural developments. And finally, there's a sort of interesting phase. They were interested in nation building. Now, this is a long time before Federation, but we're actually talking about the concept of, I suppose, promoting the interests of the colony, both New South Wales, and of course you realise a year later in 1880, Melbourne, the sister colony, was also mounting an international exhibition. So there was a fair bit of rivalry between the two colonies. But at that time they were interested in promoting intercolonial partnerships, and you know, one of the interesting things was that many of the, as part of that concept, when the government came on board, they actually created a commission of 36 commissioners. 3/4 of these people were politicians or ex-politicians, but they came from a broad diversity of backgrounds, whether it was law, commerce, manufacturing, and the pastoral industry. So these were men who were wealthy, they were professionals, they were well connected, but they also had had an enormous amount of experience in those relative areas. And a great number of them had actually previously served as New South Wales commissioners to the international commissions held abroad. So they came with this, you know, armed with this knowledge. Parkes, I think, is fascinating. You know, many of you are very aware of his personal history and his political history. But in this instance, I think one of the things that was part of my interest, the interest that came from my research, was he was an avid collector. Jonathan, in one of his symposiums, talks about a bowerbird. Well, this is the original two-legged bowerbird. Parkes amassed amazing collections of decorative arts, paintings, sculpture, furniture. He actually, how he managed to do this, and he was married 3 times and had 17 children on a public service range, is beyond one. But you know, the proof was really he was actually declared bankrupt on several occasions, and to recover those insolvencies, he had to sell these collections. But actually, going through the sale catalogues of those of his collections, one is actually struck by not only, you know, the diversity of his collecting, but the range. You know, he collected wonderful quality things, he collected autographs of famous people. I mean, I think the thing is that he was a collector at heart. The other element that I think is really important to remember is that his support of the Sydney International Exhibition was because he was an artisan, he was a craftsman. He had trained, he originally was born in England, he had trained as a turner, an ivory turner, bone turner in Birmingham. So he was an artisan who had, you know, first-hand experience of actually crafting beautiful and you know, utilitarian objects. He tried to make a go of it when he came out to Australia and failed, and went into politics instead, which was much more his calling. But I think with that knowledge, you know, part of when you read his biographies, you know, he wasn't a well-educated man. His father had been a tenant farmer who was evicted, and he more or less had a very rudimentary education, which was then supplemented in Birmingham by the attendance at the school mechanics institutes. He went to, you know, he availed himself of the free reading libraries, went to lectures. And so he had the same vision for the colony and for the working man here as well. So the Garden Palace was enormously important because it was meant to bring to New South Wales the best of you know, the world's exhibits in manufacture, arts and crafts, and technology and machinery. And so, you know, the Garden Palace was open to everyone. I mean, it was a relatively inexpensive ticket price, and over 1 million people came. This is at a time in 1879 when there were only 200,000 people in the population of New South Wales.
Yeah, and I mean that whole notion too that of course the learning through those mechanic institutes, learning through the Sydney Institute, and that sort of hands-on learning and education becomes a really sort of important way of educating the whole community. But also it's quite interesting that he was so involved in the arts. We've laughed before about, imagine if a Prime Minister today, not a Prime Minister, but even the Premier of New South Wales was to be so interested in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, how that would go down.
That is fascinating. Although I have to say it's been interesting that some of our better ministers of arts have also been premiers of the state, so, you know, the ones who've achieved a lot. In his time, during the Sydney International Exhibition and at the close of the Melbourne International Exhibition, Sir Henry Parkes managed to spend some £19,000, which, quick calculation, was actually $2 million in our money on art. He actually acquired a massive collection of European and British furniture, decorative arts, paintings, prints, sculpture, and
furniture.
And furniture, yep. And the nucleus of that collection actually still survives today. These were actually acquired as furnishings for his own offices in the Colonial Secretary's building, and 3/4 of that original collection still survive intact, in situ in the offices. And it's an amazing collection to see. So he was grandiose. I mean, he was the Colonial Secretary, and so these were, it was a collection befitting his status. But on the other hand, the other collections that he acquired were actually purchased and bestowed upon the National Art Gallery. He had intended for, some of the objects to go to the new Technological Museum. And you still see, as you walk around the Botanic Gardens today, remnants of his legacy. So, for example, a number of the copies of Roman and Greek classical statues were amongst his acquisitions. Over on the far side, you'll see a wonderful bronze statue of a hunter and dogs. And that was, in fact, purchased from the Melbourne International Exhibition, but exhibited here. And it's one of the works of art that survived the Garden Palace fire. And so, his legacy is throughout. But interestingly enough, I think, there's some dispute about the quality of his taste. The art gallery, in fact, deaccessioned most of the pictures, the continental and British pictures that he bought. That was done in the 1950s. But of course, this reflects changes in taste in art gallery collections. And but many of those works still survive. And I have to say that a number of those actually are now in the collection of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, a wonderful collection of ceramics by Wedgwood and glass by Thomas Webb and Sons. Now, the interesting thing was that because he had this amazing government budget that, interestingly enough, wasn't approved by Parliament, and it was subsequently discovered. And I haven't unravelled the trail, but creative accountancy is probably the best explanation for that. But these were actually masterpieces of their time. And one of the things that was really relevant to all international exhibitions around the world was that manufacturers like Wedgwood, Dalton, actually created wonderful tour de force pieces for exhibition. And they were beyond the reach of the average man. But of course, someone with deep pockets like Parkes was able to acquire them, and they're now part of our state collections.
Yeah, and some of the work that Anne's been doing, which is extraordinary, which has actually been piecing those stories together. So actually finding and connecting those histories. We've been lucky enough. I'd encourage you all to go down to the Palm House, which is just down the pathway there, and there's some beautiful photographs of the international exhibition, which is part of that, which is part of the evidence that people like Anne have been pulling together and piecing the dots together to show where these objects have come from. And often we can find those objects, like especially some of that ceramics in the powerhouse. We can see them on display in those photographs. And we can start connecting the dots, which is kind of an important process. And so it's really important to remember, and this is something that took me, I was a little fresh to the whole story, but one of the things that was really important for me to understand, which I'd like to sort of reinforce again, was that idea that the international exhibition was for 1 year of the Garden Palace life. So the international exhibition, after 1 year, was packed up and sent down to Melbourne. And so the objects that we're talking about are really objects that were pulled out, were purchased by the government, or sometimes even gifted. A lot of the French and Japan courts gifted material to the Australian, to the colony. And it's those objects that survive the Garden Palace. So when we talk about objects that survive the Garden Palace, it's really material that was pulled out before the fire. Because unfortunately, there is a... Oh, do you want to talk about the elephant and some of that history? Because there is a few things that were allegedly pulled out of the fire.
I'm sorry, that's a furphy. so this was an elephant made of graphite that was supposed to have survived the fire, but I'm told by a very reputable source, this is a curator from the Museum of Planets and Sciences, it was actually sent to Melbourne, so it wasn't even in the Garden Palace during the fire. I think the other thing that I probably didn't, and I'll just elaborate quickly, because while we're in this environment, the other thing that was so important that Sir Henry Parkes was able to initiate or implement was really in collaboration with the colonial architect, James Barnett. It was that amazing, the commissioning of public sculpture everywhere we walk. I mean, I urge you to look at the Colonial Secretary's building as you walk past it, because there are these wonderful allegorical statues of justice and the arts and sciences created by Achilles Simonetti, and similarly, who was the artist or sculptor responsible for the Philip Memorial. During his time as Premier, and he was 5 times Premier of the State from 1872, he embarked with Barnett on this incredible project of commissioning public sculpture, well, starting really from as early as 1870 with the statue of Captain Cook by Thomas Woolner. During the time that the Garden Palace was open and work was being completed by Barnett on the General Post Office, wonderful array again of sculpture by largely Italian-born sculptors. I mean, Parkes did have an affinity with Italy and visited several times, but he also had, developed this wonderful network or relationships with Italian artists and sculptors who were in the colony. That's one of the important outcomes of the Garden Palace, that a number of influential artists, architects came out during that time, remained in the colony, and they stayed on to practice or to teach. And a very good example is, of course, the French-born artist Lucien Henry, who became a teacher of modelling at the Mechanics School of Arts, and then became one of the first teachers of drawing at the Sydney Technical College that was set up. And of course, Henry was the one who was to create a repertoire of designs for architecture and decorative arts, drawing elements from Australian flora and fauna. And you'll see evidence of that on the palace gates. I mean, Barnett was very much interested in incorporating Indigenous designs of flora and fauna into his architectural works as well.
I mean, the one thing we talked about too, which is something which I thought was extraordinary and needed to be said, was that, of course, Barnett's office was right next door to Henry Parkes. So they were literally sharing an office on the corner of Bridge and Macquarie Street with windows that overlook the Garden Palace and have a direct visual relationship. So the pair of them, we can only imagine that the pair of them were sitting there puffing their pipes and looking at this extraordinary building going up. But it is an interesting relationship that the colonial architect was so connected, literally connected to the Premier. But also it's interesting that relationship that they both have and the affinity they both have to art is also what undoes Barnett. Yes. Are you able to talk a little bit about that story?
Okay. Well, if you go to what was the General Post Office, which is now the Westin Hotel, sorry.
Oh, yeah, right.
Have a good look at the sculptures that appear on the spandrels of the arches facing Pitt Street?
Pitt Street, yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
And you'll see that there are a series of vignettes of people, colonial figures, men, women going about their ordinary everyday practice. I mean, there's a postman delivering letters. Now, this was interesting because, they were very much unlike the neoclassical sculptures of Queen Victoria and, the other sort of, wonderful allegorical figures on other facades of the building representing the empire, because these were everyday figures. Now, Barnett approved it with the support of Parkes. However, this was a cause célèbre. It actually caused great consternation in the colony amongst, leading members of the artistic circle of society, and also amongst society, because they were considered really not noble enough really to be depicted on the facade of a major civic building. And people as eminent as Sir Frederick Leighton, the famous Victorian painter, were drawn into the argument as, images were sent to Britain for comment. They remained. It was interesting that, they survived this controversy, but they were actually a wonderful example of really. It was an Italian-born sculptor, Tommaso Sani, who actually was responsible for them. But it was actually a link between, I suppose, really, a colonial view of life and, a modern-day building. I mean, I think one of the things that has to be said was that, Barnett is another hero of mine. He was very much interested in promoting the use of local materials. Almost most of the public buildings that he designed and furnished obviously feature sandstone, Sydney sandstone, New South Wales cedar. A lot of the furnishings were actually commissioned from local cabinet makers. There are, the uses of local marbles like Marula marbles. So there, and this is actually evident at Government House, where Barnett was colonial architect responsible for the maintenance of the buildings. So I think it's, that pride in local materials, but it was also heralding the beginning of the quality of local craftsmen, and that, we weren't importing, they weren't using chimney pieces of British or, European marbles and that sort of thing. So it's like very much, it was a turning point in I suppose, the standards of architecture, of interior fittings in the colony. Interesting enough, this is very much reflected in the Garden Palace, because the interiors were decorated by a whole series of Sydney painters and decorators, and a very famous firm was Lyon and Cottier, whose work have survived and are featured in Parliament House and very notably at Government House. There are some wonderful drawing rooms that still have their 1879 aesthetic movement ceilings. So I hope that's thrown enough light on it.
Well, no, and just with you talking then, I also remembered, of course, there's another extraordinary character who I guess needs to be acknowledged in the Garden Palace, which is John Young, and the building firm who had a very close relationship with Barnett and actually were able to pull this building off in a very short time frame, in 8 months. Creating this entire building, this enormous building, 250 metres wide and 250 metres long and 150 metres wide. So there's also something interesting going on there with Young and Barnett, who was also responsible of working in collaboration with Barnett a lot.
That's right. I mean, Young had been involved, I think, in building the great exhibition, the Crystal Palace in London, so had first-hand knowledge. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's interesting, that, it was a collaborative team who were to erect a building of that stature, of that scale in less than 8 months was extraordinary. And I think that was the thing that was so exciting about its, it was one of the major achievements for the colony that, really the colonists were incredibly proud of. The other thing I probably think, just in going back to politicians, was that it wasn't just Sir Henry Parkes. There were a number of leading colonial politicians, and Sir Alfred Stevens is another favourite of mine. He had been Chief Justice of New South Wales and was Lieutenant Governor for something like 20-odd years. And he was instrumental in trying to support the establishment of major cultural institutions. I think as we sit here, we can see, the rooftop of the State Library, and we know that the National Gallery is behind us. And but of course, in 1879, those institutions weren't here, and that was one of the major drives. One of the, I suppose, the aspirations behind the people who were instrumental in supporting the Sydney International Exhibition was that they were very hopeful that the outcome of the exhibition would be the establishment of a proper art gallery, a free public library that might have been on the same scale and stature of the one in Melbourne. I mean, again, that rivalry. Melbourne, of course, had a national gallery, it had a public library and a museum by 1860. So New South Wales was well behind. But, this was the impetus. And of course, one of the things that, that really supported the final achievement of those institutions was that visitors came to the Garden Palace, they could see for themselves, you know, the results of the fine arts, the decorative arts sent from Europe and the United States and Great Britain, and they were, you know, moved to be able to, you know, to want those similar cultural institutions in their own colony.
Mm. I was keen to also ask you too, because one of the things I remember you were working at the Government House, and which I always thought was an extraordinary challenge, to have a functioning house that was operational every day, almost like there was almost a function, or more than one function a day, but also treat it as not a museum, but to keep its heritage intact in some way, and the challenges of preserving something that was functioning and moving. And I thought you did an amazing job there, balancing some of those stories. But I guess I was keen to ask you too to comment on, and it might get a little bit political now, so everyone block your ears, but some of the issues around at the moment, because we are about to lose some of our most important buildings along Bridge Street that are connected with James Barnett and this history, and I guess what your ideas around how those buildings work, or how can we hold on to them, or what we can do to them, or, you know, is there a way that we can, I mean, even that idea that we can't call the General Post Office anymore, I find awkward. Mm. Sorry.
Yes, put me on the spot. It is a controversial subject. I think, you know, many of you are aware that the Lands Department and the Education Department buildings, and we're uncertain about the future of the Colonial Secretary's building, you know, have been sold, and they're you know, they as surplus to the government needs. And of course, the Lands Department, I think, is mooted to become an international hotel. I think it's very difficult in this day and age to conserve all buildings. You know, one's aware of the sort of budget cutbacks and sort of government funding and that sort of thing. And I'm not against the idea of reusing heritage buildings for another purpose. I think that, you know, as long as it's done sensitively, that there is a respect for the, you know, for the original design and integrity of the building. You know, there are many good instances where that sort of renewed use has worked, and maybe, I mean, the post office is a good example of that. I'm not answering this, I'm sort of skirting the question.
No,
but I think the important thing is that it has to be transparent. You know, I know that Sydney's Living Museum have Sydney Open coming up in November, and they're wonderful opportunities to see inside many of these wonderful buildings. And I think part of it is that, you know, there has to be, you know, legislation that will protect and preserve those buildings. But, you know, with the understanding that there are new technologies and ways that we can actually, you know, change the original function, to adapt the original function to something that will be useful and conserve the building's long-term lifetime.
Yeah, no, and I guess that notion too, that we need to know that they're our heritage, we need to know that they're our buildings, and we need to love them. Otherwise they will become someone else's.
Yes.
and they will turn into something else. So I'd encourage, and I think that Living Museums, the Sydney Open program that is run, is an extraordinary program that gets us into buildings that are our buildings, and, you know, you fall in love with them. They are extraordinary buildings that we should be thinking about, and that should be on our mind, and we should be considering where they go. I thought maybe should we try and take some questions? Yeah. Sorry, I could ask questions of Anne all day. Yeah. There we go. Sure.
Just wondered, is it known how the fire started?
Is it known how the fire started, for anyone who didn't hear the question? Do you want to answer that? Or do you want me to?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
So there's, I guess the only way I've described it is that there's a number of benefits, or perceived benefits, that came out of the fire. So all the records were lost, as we discussed. and of course there's commentary around the idea that those records, of course, wiped the slate clean for anyone of convict heritage, because those convict records were in the building. There was also commentary around do you want to talk? There we go.
No. I mean, there are all sorts of rumours, so we may as well put a few down on the table. One tends to forget because Macquarie Street has changed so much. But behind us, where the Royal Historical Society is, there were magnificent terrace houses. You know, there were very grand residences here. So, you know, that old Sydney problem, it has been claimed that someone started the fire because the Garden Palace obscured the views of the residents across the road. I can't bear out the veracity of that, but that's another rumour as well.
So yeah, there was benefits. There was the police report that someone was seen running away from the building, but no one was ever charged and nothing ever came of it. So yeah, it's a complete mystery really, to tell you the truth. But in fact, Anne just brought up a really important point, that in fact over the road is one of those original terraces with the Historic Society. And I'd encourage all of you to drop in there. They're an extraordinary group of people who are doing really beautiful work. And in fact, they're the custodians of Ethel Pockley's letter. So a young girl who was living on Macquarie Street and who woke up and saw the fire and commented on it in a beautiful letter. It's an extraordinary letter written by her to her brother Frank. So I'd encourage you all to look at those, to look at the letter, and yeah, there's some great resources over there at that Historic Society. Any other questions? Oh, is it a bit? I can just run there.
Jonathan, I was fortunate enough to go to your second symposium, and I left reflecting, and we talked about it today, how quickly the building came about. But I thought, we talk about Barnett, we talked about parks, but who curated, who got all the objects for the exhibition together in such a short space of time, because communications and transport were so different. So I just wondered if...
It's a really good question. Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry.
Well, that's where that body of 36 commissioners was very vital. As I mentioned, a number of them had already served as New South Wales commissioners to earlier international exhibitions. So they had developed their networks. And in fact, that body of men were also supported by honorary advisors as well. So we had, leading curators, professors of geology, all sorts of scientific and art, cultural individuals involved who offered support and advice. So in that short time, the other thing that was very critical to the success of the international exhibition in Sydney was the establishment of an advisory committee in London that was chaired by the Prince of Wales. And the patron was in fact the former governor, the Earl of Belmore. So you had, a gentleman who had first-hand knowledge of the colony. You had the imprimatur, of vice royalty, and then, this was actually a business. Each of one of the things that we found out from researching, Parks in fact had an advisor, an Italian gentleman called Oscar Meyer, who in fact, there was a bit of nepotism because Parks in fact appointed him to a number of exhibitions following, but he would in fact go and scout all the exhibits, negotiate deals, get cheaper discounts for Sir Henry Parkes. But there were a number of people in the same position who were representatives of different countries. So I think actually you could actually liken it to the Olympic movement, where you have all those country representatives who go and do the circuit, and so they've built up all their connections and their networks, and so they can easily put their hand to information or contact the right person. So and the fact that in this instance, it was a long way to send goods and materials and machinery and the bulk of the equipment. But they were influenced by the fact that firstly you had the exhibition in Melbourne, and the following year it was to be in Melbourne, so two for the price of one. It was it was a very lucrative venture for many of the firms that exhibited, particularly in Great Britain. Great Britain was one of the biggest exporters of machinery, of household goods to Australia. And so, you know, this is one of the reasons why they were able to achieve the exhibition in such a short time.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I thought, that just building on that, which I was always struck by, was, like most people, I've always perceived the idea and bought, I guess, probably the bulletins line of this idea of wool, wheat and gold that dominated, or seems to dominate our psyche. But what's quite interesting is when you go through the list of exhibitors, I'm struck by the extraordinary talents that Australia was, you know, that New South Wales and Australia at large was engaging in. So there was people making paints in Redfern, there was bookbinders, there was pottery makers, there was just an amazing wealth of people starting to spring up and show their material. This was the first time, this was David Jones was in here, Mackenzie Spices were in here, a whole bunch of very familiar businesses that we recognise today were starting to display their material. And I mean, really, everything keeps coming back to that enormous boost in economy that the gold rush provided, that there was this phenomenal amount of money that created businesses and seeded businessmen to create all sorts of activity. And I find it really interesting that when I went through that list, that, like, I mean, wool, wheat and gold and coal and those raw materials were there, yes, and were on display very much, and our wood. But there was a phenomenal amount of people manufacturing bagpipes, pianos, like these things that were being made here that, you know, we just don't talk about in terms of Australia being a country known for these things.
I think that's very relevant, and perhaps if I can put my feminist cap on, one of the things that was very important about international exhibitions in Australia was it was also the platform for women. Now, women at that point weren't given a say. You know, there were no women on the committees for the Sydney International Exhibition, but they were able to exhibit in the Garden Palace, many of them in the ladies' court. They were actually segregated to a ladies' court. But in fact, when you go through the catalogues, you find that there are professional women artists who are exhibiting in the other categories. And, you know, a very famous one that you may be aware of is, of course, the flower painter, Marion Ellis Rowan. She exhibited here in Sydney, but in 1880 in Melbourne, carried off the gold medal. And that was actually the first time that women were able to participate in what we would call a public domain. And, you know, incrementally that grew to a stage where, whilst they didn't have a say in selection or judging or running, subsequent exhibitions we see the emergence of women, particularly by 1907 when there was a women's work exhibition held in Melbourne, where it was totally managed by women, you know, the selection, the curation, the mounting of the exhibition, and that again marked a turning point. But this is actually another episode of the history. But I think it's really important to remember the women.
Well, and I think that's quite interesting too, because the only two things that I've found that engage with Aboriginal knowledge is, of course, two women. Someone makes biscuits with the cycad palm, with those nuts, yes. And is obviously, because they're poisonous nuts, they're nuts that need to be leached and cooked and treated very carefully before you use them to make flour. So that woman must have had a very close relationship to some Aboriginal people to get that knowledge. And then, of course, the second thing I found was someone was making yarn from possum fur, which also I thought was quite interesting. So the two women, the only two examples I can find of someone working with Aboriginal knowledge and working with local Indigenous materials are, of course, women.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, good.
Any other questions?
I think that's it.
No?
No?
Okay, well, we've been so lucky to have Anne here today. You can see why. She's definitely been one of those people who have inspired me, and always, even today, I found out things that I hadn't heard before. But I'd encourage you all to come back every day. We're having our lunchtime lectures, and we're finding out working with another person who has an extraordinary wealth of knowledge that starts filling in the gaps. I stress this and I stress it again, but this story is not one person's story. You know, this is a story made up of countless ideas, countless knowledge holders, and this is, you know, an attempt to try and fill in some of those gaps. So, I'd encourage you all to come back and join us. Again, at 3 o'clock, the Gumbangir kids, students are going to be doing a performance on the other lawn, so please stick around for that. But please join me in welcoming Anne thanking Anne
Thank you.
for an amazing talk.